All right, we're back. We are COMP1073, that's client-side scripting, and week 10, part 2 of our broadcast. We just finished talking about just the beginnings of jQuery and how to be a little bit smarter when using JavaScript and jQuery. I've added in a type definition library for jQuery in TypeScript just to make it easier, but you don't have to use it at all. You can simply do it in the JS file, like I showed you. The only problem with the JS file is, for most IDEs and text editors, they give you 0 code hinting. Now, WebStorm does give you pretty good code hinting for jQuery out of the box, right? And you can actually point to the type definitions for WebStorm. But you know what? It's far, far easier and better to, for a transportability perspective, not to depend on an IDE or a text editor to do it for you, but actually to use some tools like the type listing through TypeScript. By the way, even if you don't use TypeScript and you want to get code hinting, you can still use that trick. You can still do an npm install at types and then the type that you're looking for, jQuery, without using TypeScript whatsoever. And it'll still work with Visual Studio Code. You'll still get code hinting without using TypeScript at all. Okay? So to demonstrate that, because let's not use TypeScript for today, right? Let's turn it off. How do I turn off TypeScript? Well, I can press F1. F1 allows me to terminate my tasks. I can kind of terminate my running task, which is what I want to do. So it stops my running task, right? And I'm just going to kind of get out of here for a second. I'm going to delete, for now, I'm going to delete my app.ts because there's no extra information in there, right? So delete this one. Actually, you know what? Let's, yeah, it's fine. Doesn't matter. Same thing with my map file. I'll get rid of that too. And all I care about is my, oh, that's not what I wanted. Hold on a second, let me retrieve those. Happens sometimes, huh? So I want to do this. And I want to delete this. So I'm going to remove my typings, my TS file, right? And I only have my JS file, right? Just to show you that it works like this. And I still have this whole reference stuff. Now, if you notice, I'm using just vanilla JavaScript here. But I want to get good code hinting for JavaScript or TypeScript with JavaScript. And the way I can do that is the exact same way, right? So here's get element by ID. Now I've already got my typings in place. And so I can do something like this. I can say, well, bar main nav is equal to, again, hey, jQuery, take a look. I'm still getting code hinting. Whether I'm using TypeScript or not now, when I use @types and I install the type that I want, I get code hinting, which is definitely what I want, right? So I'm using pure JavaScript now. There is no TypeScript here involved. I'm not transpiling anymore, right? I go, hey, I'm using this whole thing, right? And I can say, you know, main nav. And of course, I'm going to look at the 0th element because I want the first element that matches that, that stuff here. And I can just comment this out. It's still going to work the exact same way. So if I go back up here like this, you can see that it's kind of restarted the server. I'm going to go here to my files and refresh, and I should still see my main nav, right? Oh, wait a minute. Where'd it go? How come? What happened, right? Because remember, just like you said, jQuery runs differently than JavaScript in that you need to have CSS syntax inside your query selector string, this piece here. I do that now, and it restarts my server. Now I get my nav bar back. Okay, make sense? Just want to point that out, and thank you for that. All right, so let's go back. So we talked about the selector. We've talked about different kinds of common things we can use with jQuery. Here's a submit to submit the form. Here's a focus to move the focus to a selected form. There's some common, very, very common things we can do, right? Here's some more. How to get the value from a text box. So I have a text box, an example called gallons with an ID of gallons, and I want to get the value that's inside the text box, and I want to store it in the variable gallon. Okay. Here's another one. How to set the value. So remember, there's 2 ways of doing val, right? One way is the setter, this first part, and down here is the way you. Sorry, this is the getter, and this is the setter. Setter means whatever is input inside these parentheses, that's the value that's being sent to the text box. Okay, that's what the setter is. I'm sending something to the thing. And here, when there's nothing inside, I'm just getting the value. So the way it works is, This is actually sending an empty value, which means I'm clearing, right? I'm clearing the value for this input element to nothing, to 0. So it doesn't have a value at all. How to set the text in an element, right? So again, let's say I have an element that's called email address error. That's what the ID is. I'm looking at the text element of that, and I'm setting it to email address is required. That's the text element of the ID that or the element that has an ID of email address error. Notice I did that in one step. I didn't even have to declare a variable, right? If I want to do special effects now with jQuery, I don't have to declare a variable. All I got to do is point to it and then have some kind of method to do something with it. Here's something else you can go with next. Next goes to the next sibling. So hey, let's look at the last name. Some object or some HTML element, and actually the way you should read it is this. Return all HTML elements with an ID of last name. Go to the next one on the list and take a look at the text value and assign it a value of last name is required. So how to set the text for the next sibling with an object, with object chaining is what it's called, right? Notice that I'm using 2 dots, dot next and then dot text. And you can do that with jQuery. jQuery allows this idea of method chaining or object chaining, where you can chain a bunch of things at one after the other. So, and here's the dot submit. So I have a form. Usually dot submit only works on a form. And I want to submit, and I want to take the form and submit it to this joint list. So any element, a form that has an ID of joint list, submit it. It does actually submit. So instead of pressing the submit button, you can use code to do it for you. You can point to that form and activate the submission. Yeah.
Why do you not need to have an index on the array that it's returning?
Because I'm returning more than one element, and whenever we do object chaining like this, it works on the first element. That's why, right? So this is going to submit the first form that returns with an ID of joint list. And here's another one, how to move the focus to a form controller link. So focus means where my web page is, where's my cursor in my form, right? So right now I'm going to say, hey, go to my email address text element, and then shift the focus there to that one. Move my cursor inside there. That's what this is doing. All right, and we talked about methods, right? What they are is they're functions that are inside of jQuery. So typically the syntax is as follows. $, which is, hey, jQuery, give me that selector, and then do something. Notice sometimes it also takes this idea of an anonymous function right here as a callback. Here's the callback function part right here, starting from function, this part. Right, this part here is the anonymous function that it takes as a callback. Remember a callback? We use that for things like event listeners. We can use it like this here in jQuery to do something. So it says, hey, do something, and then after you're done doing that, do this as a callback function. And here's some very, very common ones. The ready event, okay? The ready event is like the IFI. I can write an IFI with the ready event method, the ready event syntax. Let me show you that. So I'm going to go back to my code. And I can do something like this at the top here. Instead of using it this way, right, with a function, I notice that I'm going to shift around here. So notice that my handler, right, is the anonymous function. Here it is right here, right? So instead of writing it this way, where it ends like this, right, which is kind of confusing to some people, you can write it like this. Hey, jQuery. Right? Or to say, hey, jQuery, I can say, hey, jQuery, how about when the document is ready, here's my ready. When the document is ready, then perform this anonymous function. This syntax is the same as this syntax, this IFI syntax here. Okay? Now, I don't think this is any easier to be honest with you. I don't think there's any, you know, when you look at this, you're like, what the hell does that mean? It's not intuitive what this is, right? same as the other one. Like, so this is the original. Let me show you both, right? So the original looks like this. Right? This is the original. Iffy, right? And this is the jQuery version. Still a closure, right? But it says the following. It says, hey, wait till the document is ready and then activate anything that's in here. This doesn't do that. This says, hey, wait for the doc, just as soon as you see this, execute. That's what it says. It doesn't wait for the document to be ready. In order for me to wait for the document to be ready, as an example, I'd have to make a name for it. Like, for example, let's just call this the main function. And then I can call the main window function on that. I can say window.onReady, or onload, I'll be okay. Onload, right, is equal to main function. It's kind of the same thing, right, compared to this. This loads as soon as the window is ready. And by the way, what's ready? You can also specify. I want the document to be ready. I want the window to be ready. Right? What do you want to be ready? Right? Here I want the document to be ready, right? When the document's ready, do something. Okay. To be honest with you, I much prefer this. This is clean. I understand what it means, and I don't need to try and figure out what this means. And it works just the same, right? I'm all for this syntax, to be honest with you. When I first started, I was like, what the heck is this? What is this function inside of these brackets? What does that mean, right? Whenever you look at this, you always have to think this. Anything that's here, if I was to write just this part, the brackets, like this, right? What I'm actually saying is, hey, take whatever in this and call it. That's what that part is, right? And then when I write the function inside, hey, take whatever in this function, right? Oops, I kind of made too many brackets, I think. No, function. Oh, yeah, I didn't spell function right. Hey, take whatever's in this function and call it. That's what they're saying. So take this anonymous function, call this thing, this whole thing, this structure that I got over here. By the way, the ECMAScript 6 standard for writing this is the IFI with this vanilla JavaScript. So JavaScript, which is ES5, ECMAScript 5 version, the old version of JavaScript. And the new version of JavaScript looks like this. Right, so IFI with JavaScript ECMAScript 6 or ECMAScript 2015, same thing, right? It doesn't look like this anymore. It looks like this. It's the new version. By the way, they're all pretty much equivalent, right? This is the new version. And this is using something called arrow syntax, right? Arrow means returns, right? So, hey, function returns this, we do this, and then execute. So it's a little bit sleeker. We've taken out the function word because we know what this does. Still, it's the exact same from one to the other. There's no difference in it. And by the way, we're running app.js. We're not in app.ts. We're still making this whole thing work. All right, here's one thing we had a problem with. We actually created other folders for objects. Remember these objects? I've got my car object, my point object, my vehicle object. Those things are written in TypeScript and in JavaScript, right? Does everything still work? Like, how is it still working? Because JavaScript is compatible with TypeScript, and because we've connected everything as before, right? These things here, even though they're written in transpile from TypeScript to JavaScript, still work as modules. There's no difference here, so we don't have to change anything. All right. For now, let's just get rid of this. I just wanted to show it to you, so you're not confused when you see the functionality or the syntax. That's one. That's very common. .ready. The other one that's even more common is the click event. That's like an add event listener. Let's show you how I can use this one. So how do I use add event listener? Well, we already have it, right? Inside of our code, we have areas where we're doing event listeners, right? Here's one, nav xr, xhr, add event listener, right? But we want the click event. So whenever we do a click event, right? So if I search for controller command F, if I look for click, right? Here's one, right? This one here on my line 140, where I have my button array, and for each button in the button array, add an event listener. Remember, I did that. Okay, maybe I had more than one buttons, the show button, you know, my and a bunch of other buttons, my half size button, my hide button, that was in my projects folder, right? So if I go to my projects page, I have all these buttons, 1, 2, 3, 4 buttons, right? And these buttons are in a button array. So if I click on 50%, it does something, 75% does something else. I can hide and I can show. That's what we did last time with our with JavaScript, right? Well, these are all the buttons. And I did this. I said, hey, for every button, take the event listener, the click event, and then do the button click. Well, I can write this with jQuery like this. Hey, button, on click, right? Do this. Same thing. This is the vanilla way, the vanilla JavaScript way, and this is the jQuery way. Notice that we have the click right here. So instead of saying button.add event listener, click, all that extra syntax, it cuts down to this. I'm okay with this. This is good syntax, right? I'm using a method called click, right, to activate the button click event. Okay, let's see if this still works. So remember my array of buttons. Oh, okay, so does it still work? Oh man, what happened? How come it's not working? And if you look to see what's happening here, if I do an inspect, right, not getting any errors, right? So, but the button's not working. How come it's not working? Why do you think this, my button, right, and the click button event, here's my button I'm getting, here's my button, which is an element, right? I'm using the button event, right? How come this is not working? Well, because the way I'm referencing this event, this button, is it's an HTML element. I'm not returning it as jQuery. In order for me to get a reference to the button, right, whatever that button is, I need to get a reference to it as jQuery, right? So in my for each loop, this is the incorrect, it's not a correct construct for this, the way I'm doing it, right, for each button. Because I'm trying to do the click event of a button, but I'm trying to treat this button like it's a jQuery object, but it's not. It's just a button. This is an HTML element. To convert it to jQuery, right, I'd have to, in my button event itself, whatever the button is, I'd have to cast this as jQuery, right? And then it would work, right? So is this the correct structure for each button, right? Because I'm going 1, 2, 3 buttons. And no, the answer is no. So how would I do this? How would I make a button? Well, let's get back to that. So I'll undo my changes. So here's my button that add event listener, right? This is the original one. And I want to still reference this button. This button is an HTML element, right? That's what this is, HTML element. But this button also has some special features, right? Button itself, right? For each button in the button array. The button array, if you see what it is, here's my button array, references these buttons, hide button, the half size button, the 3/4 size button. And if I hover over a button array, it says it's an array of HTML elements. Each one is an array of HTML elements. Okay? Cool. I like it. Okay? So instead of writing it like this, jQuery would make me write it like this. So I'm going to just loop the buttons in a for loop for a second. Let's just comment it out. Now you were going to say, why all this extra work to convert from something that worked to something that's new? Like, you know, why would we do all this kind of work? So I'm going to say here's my for loop, right? So for my, let's say if I let my my button count, so count, right? For count is equal to 0, where count is less than my button array dot length, right? If it's less than the button array dot length, then count plus plus. My for loop, right? I can write it like this too. And then what I can say is the following. I can say, well, my button array is an array, right? And I'm getting references to each of my buttons, right? These are all my buttons in my button array. My hide button is just an element, and my element itself has a name and an ID attribute and all this other stuff, right? So I could do, I want to get references to this button itself. So the button array is not an it's not an array of jQuery. It's an array of buttons. I'm getting this button array, as an example, is equivalent to me getting all the buttons somehow, right? So how would I do it differently? I wouldn't do this part. 138, I wouldn't do it. I would set up my own button array. I would say, well, hey, you know what, jQuery, right? I want to get all buttons, and for each of the buttons that I get back, right, each of these things that match button, right, the button type, right, I want to add an event listener, the click event listener for them. So instead of doing this loop, let's put it on hold for a second. I could do this. Hey, array. Hey, jQuery. Get button. For every button that I get, add a click function, right? And the click function is going to be my button click event. Do I have to do a for each or a for? No, it's for every button. Every button, add a click event. And the click event is going to be this one, right? I don't need this button array anymore. Let's see if this works. So refresh, click it now, no problem, right? How did this work? I just I just cut all this out. And you know what? I also cut this out. 138, I don't even need 138 anymore. I don't need an array of buttons. My array of buttons is right here, right? That declares an array of buttons. Say, hey, on this array of buttons, add an event listener that's a click event and refer it back to this one. Yay, done. Does that make sense? Are we good? So, you know what? It's short form, right? But you need to understand what this syntax means. It doesn't mean look at a button. It means look at all buttons. Every button that we return. If I have multiple buttons on my form, it gets them all, right? And this can be problematic. It can be problematic because what if I want buttons on my form not to do something? Yeah. I didn't change anything here, just this. Right? That's the problem. I'm returning everything. If I want to, I could assign this as a button array. Watch. So this is a button array. The button itself, this one. I could make it so that it is jQuery, right? So I could call this var buttons, or instead of var, we can use let. That's the right way to do it. So let buttons equal to jQuery. So I'll just break it out for you so you can see it this way. jQuery, hey jQuery. All the buttons that are on the page. That's what buttons is now. And if you notice, if I hover over, it says jQuery. Okay, cool. I like jQuery. Thank you. And now let's do, to make it, just break it down, we'll do a buttons click on, whenever we click on buttons, whenever we click on the buttons, then do something else. This is the same way, but adding a variable in here. And why would I do this variable as opposed to write it without a variable? If I need to refer to this again. If I need to do this again, buttons, I don't have to redo this part. And this is just representative of the return. This is the query that's been returned by jQuery searching for all the buttons on the page. So jQuery takes that selector, whatever you put in the selector, it searches the entire document, the DOM, right, for things that match that selector, and then returns all those things inside of the variable that you're storing it in. So it's an array of elements that matches this button. Are we clear? So again, I'm writing in here in 2 lines, but if you just take this away, you're writing it in 1 line without this part. I can't do this. So I can't do this. This is a different thing. Right? Now if I hover over buttons, it's still jQuery. Here's my jQuery. But it actually refers to something else. It's not just referring to this part here. It's referring to the whole thing. Right? So I wouldn't do this. And I like breaking it out like this. When I use jQuery, I usually break it out just like this. I get a query result, and then I do something with it. And I can reference it again and again afterwards. It's a little clearer. You can do it chained, and you can do it without the variable. Like I wrote before, you can just get rid of this whole variable and then do it every time. Call it every single time. Still less code, right, if you think about it. All right, so that's these 2 things. And we talked about this. So if I want to do a closure, this is the long way, document.ready. This is like doing an IFI. Or I can do this, open bracket, close bracket, function, and then with a $ in front of it, alert. That'll be, these are equivalent, right? So no, even easier than the way I wrote it, without using the ready method whatsoever. Just doing this $, which is hey jQuery, do a closure and do this function. This is a short way. So there's many ways to do the same thing using jQuery. All right, here's something else. Here's some event handler examples. We did the click event. So for every H2 tag, right, H2 element, do this anonymous function. And when this click function triggers, do this anonymous function inside when the click function triggers, if I click onto it. Here's another one. Hey, when the document is ready, look at all H2 elements, and on the click event, whenever you click on any H2 elements on the page, do this. Any H2 elements. I mean, there'll be a lot of them on the page, right? Let's do some more examples. Okay, we talked about filters. So one of the things we talked about right now was selectors. So selecting something that's on the page using CSS syntax. So hashtag for ID, dot for class, right? The greater than means contains. All that other syntax that we normally use with CSS, we can now do with jQuery, right? So our selection is a little bit tighter than it was with JavaScript. Pure JavaScript, what we did, we had to search a little bit more, do a little bit more work to understand what we're getting back. And we had to use a very long method, document.getElementById, right? Here we're not doing that. We're making 1 line of code, and some people love jQuery for how simple it is. But it can also be cryptic. You look at it and you're like, so what is he doing here? Right? When you first look at someone else's jQuery, you're trying to figure out what's happening, right? Because you don't understand what's happening. You're trying to figure out their code. And because jQuery is such a short form, and you can write it really super minified, like short, you're like, okay, so what does that do again? When you first look at it. So be careful. But we can also add something else called filters with jQuery to make it even more challenging. Here's some examples. All right, attribute. So all elements with the named attribute that's built in. Okay, cool. Attribute is equal to value. All elements with the named attribute and value, whatever the value is. All right, and let's get some examples here. All right. So here's an example. All elements, all list item elements. I want only the first child of the list, all list item elements. It's the first member of every list. That's what I want here, right? Okay, cool. So I want to get even rows, right? So a table that contains only even rows. So give me all the even rows in this table, any element that is a table, right? That's what it does. Okay, so these things, okay, good. So all input elements, that's what the colon stands for, all input elements that have text as the type, right? So this is kind of an interesting list where you can filter down. GT stands for greater than, so equals a certain value. GT greater than a certain value. LT less than a certain value. So give me all elements that are less than this, whatever the value is, right? Hey, give me the text value. All element input with a type attribute set to text. The type is text. Hey, give me all visible elements, all elements that are visible. That's pretty important. Give me all those, return all a list of all the elements on the page that are visible. That means everything, right? So very, very powerful way of selecting and returning data. Okay. Here's some useful methods. We talked about the next method. It goes to the next available selector that matches, right? ATTR, attribute. This is the getter. It gets the attribute that's with this name, attribute name, whatever the attribute name is called. So example, the attribute would be ID, right? So get all this stuff with an ID of so on. Right? I want to get that ID attribute, the value of the specified attribute. I can also set the value of an attribute, but this is more common. So, hey, take a look at the selector. Now set its class value to this. Change the way it looks. Here's a good example of that. All right, so I want to get my buttons. I want to do for every button, right? I want to perform when I click on the button, it does my button click event. That's what it does, right? But what about if I want to target my first project image button or my show button and target this button specifically, right? So how do I do that? I can say something like this. I can say, hey jQuery, right? Target, an element with an ID of show button. Cool, right? And what I want to do is I want to set its attribute, right? There's two, right? There's different overloads here, right? So I want to set a certain attribute. I want to set its class attribute, right, to button danger, right? And you know what? Button large. That's what I want to do. I want to set its class attribute, so the button's class attribute to button danger, button large. Okay? Does that make sense what I'm doing? The button itself, right, the show button, has a class that's attached to it. Let's take a look at what it looks like in the code. And that's inside of my projects page. Here's my project page. If I scroll down, right, I want to look at some buttons. Here's my hide button, right? There it is. And on the right side, there's got to be my show button. Now notice that it has my class as button primary, which means by default, it's the blue button. But now I'm going to change this so it's the red button. So now my show button is going to be red. And if I go back to my code, you can see my show button is red and it's bigger. So I made it large. So you can affect the way an element looks by changing its attribute values. Does that make sense? So these still work, these buttons. But this button here, right? If I go back to here, this button now I've made it, instead of being button primary with my code, I've set it to button danger, which is red. Let's change it to yellow. Button warning. Right, let's change it back. Let's change it to green. Button success. Right, let's change it back to blue. Button primary. These are all CSS classes that come with Bootstrap. Right? Now let's change it to small. Instead of a large button, let's make it small. Small button. Right? See the power of what I can do. I can modify one class, and I can modify it for all buttons. Right? All the buttons now. Okay? So I want all these buttons to be red. All of them. Okay? Cool. I've got this buttons object, right? So now instead of targeting one button, I want to get the buttons object. So, hey, change all the buttons. I want their class attribute to be red, which is, sorry, danger. And I want them to be small, safe, right? And that's the power of jQuery. jQuery can do things lickety-split. When you want page control and you want to access elements without touching CSS, I want to do some special effects, jQuery is the tool for you. Questions around jQuery? There's many, many more aspects to jQuery, by the way. I've just really scratched the surface with you, right? So these are just some of the things that it does, right? All right. And here's some examples. I want to change the source image, the image that's inside of my image, to something else. I want to change my color. CSS is another really common one I use. I want to add or remove or change a CSS style. For that particular object, I'm changing it to something else, color blue, right? Now, let's be honest. This isn't the best use of JavaScript or jQuery. It's only used for special effects. But remember, when I turn it to blue, if I want to turn it back, I got to have that programmed in there too. Like if I want to make some kind of toggle, right? I turn it off and on. I can add a class, right? I can also do a for each. This is my for each loop, right? So for each element that matches this, do this. For each element, right? I'm using the each method, right? Again, I wouldn't probably do it this way, only because I'm getting back an array of elements anyway, right? So here's a custom callback that I want to do for each object that I'm returning. So let's say, for example, I return all my buttons. So here's my buttons. So what I could do is another kind of function where I can say, hey, if all buttons, for each button that I want to run, let's run another function on top of it. Do something else for each of the buttons, right? For each of the buttons, do something, right? So for each iteration of the button, right? Now remember, what it's going to do is returns elements. So example, for each anchor tag element within the image list, right? Here is for all the buttons on the page. All the buttons on the page, right? Well, you know what? I want to make them the visibility of the buttons, right? Now, here's something. How do I access? What if I don't know how to use an element like this? If I kind of hover over, it says this. It says function, right? I need to make an anonymous function where I have my index as a number and my element as an element. There you go. I have index and element, right? Those are the two things I get back. I don't have to even do anything here, right? So if I say lm, right? If I go my element, I want to access that element, right? My index and my end. If I can go index, I notice it doesn't give me really much code hinting here. What about over here? Can I put like element? My element. I want to look at my element and my index. I get those two things, my index and my element. I get that, right? Here's my index, and here's my element, right? All right, so if I want to get my element, I could say something like lm, which is my element itself, which is, in this case, an HTML element. I could cast that, and I could do it right here in my function if I'm using TypeScript. I'm not using TypeScript. I'm using JavaScript right now, right? So say, well, element, whatever the element is, which is the button itself, right? I could make its, text content, the content of each of the buttons. I want to change them. I want to make them equal to, unknown. I don't know. Changing them all. See what happens. I'm going to change all the text of each of the buttons, right, to unknown. If I did it right, now they all say unknown. How did I know how to do that? Because of my code hinting, right? If I hover over each, it says it takes two. My function actually has two embedded attributes. One of them is called index, and the other one is called element, right? Element. So index, that first one, is the index of the array that I'm getting back, right? My buttons array. So I could do something like this. I could say something, instead of doing this, right? I could do something like, well, buttons and then index. Do that. The index of the button, right? I could make it so that that particular button itself, I want to do the text value of that button. I can do it this way too. Text content is equal to hello. Another way to write it. I have access to each of the buttons in the list. That's what it's saying. Hey, for each of the buttons, take the index of each of the buttons, and I want to do something with it. I want to do for each of the buttons, index, change the content to hello. Hello. Make sense? Maybe not, right? And that's where it becomes a little bit confusing for each of the buttons, for each of the elements that I return, right? What else could I do? I could also make them so that they're invisible. All the buttons become invisible. I could do that. But I can change the CSS for that, right? So how do I do that? If I want, instead of doing this is kind of interesting, but I could do something like this. I could say buttons.css, right? And I could specify the CSS, which is display, right? And instead of block, I can call it none. I can change the display CSS style of all the buttons to none. And that would happen inline. So now I'm not going to have any buttons at all. If I want to display them again, I could write them as block, right? And now they're blocked. Or I can try something else, like inline, which would still not change anything here, right? I could also change the color specifically. I can change the color of the text. This is the text color. I can change the text color to white. Or I can change it to purple, right? Or I can change it to yellow, right? I can do that with the CSS selected. Again, lots of powerful stuff here with jQuery, right? And some of it you're going to look at and go, well, why would I ever want to do that? Remember, we can use jQuery and JavaScript when CSS is difficult to use to solve problems, right? And we can do it very quickly with very few lines of code. That's why jQuery was created. jQuery was created to make JavaScript easier and to make you look like a superhero. That's what it is, right? Leave it this way just because it looks funky. And I'll make it so the button's really large. Instead of button small, I'll make them button large. Yeah, button large, show. Maybe that kind of looks good too. I don't know. Are we good? Move on a little bit more and then we'll, I don't want to overload you here because there's a lot of stuff you can do, right? Okay. Again, we talked about the ready method where the DOM is ready. The unload, when the user closes the browser window, I can do something, right? I can send a message or something. On click, when I click something. I want to toggle. This is interesting. I have two handlers. The first handler runs on even clicks of the element and start with 0, and the second handler does something afterwards. And these are two event handlers, right? Two callback functions. All right, that's interesting. So whenever I click on the button, the first time, I want to do my button click event. However, the second time I click on the button, I want to write an anonymous function to do something else. And instead of writing click, I'm going to change the click to toggle, right? So on toggle, the first one is when I do it on even, and the second one I do it on odd. And if you look at it, it tells me that. It says toggle. One thing it does, and this is something that's been changed over time, it says display or hide the matching elements. That's what toggle does, right? And it doesn't say that here. Toggle says the first handler runs on even clicks and the second handler runs on odd. And this is the old way that we used to do with jQuery. Now toggle means something else. Toggle says there's a duration, all right, which is a string, and a number, right? And what it does is it says display or hide the matched elements. That's what it does, whatever the elements is. So if that's the case, I don't even need button click here. I'll show you this for a second, right? And actually what I'll do is I'll undo this thing for a second. Just give me 1 second. I'll put it back the way it was. we go. And then I'll add a toggle down here. I'll say for, okay, buttons, dot toggle. And then I'll put that in there like this too. So click and toggle. Toggle means it'll hide the buttons, and when I click on them again, it'll show them again, right? Well, that's what it says, right? It says display or hide the matched elements. Cool. Well, how does that work? How do I? Well, look, here's they're hiding, right? I can't click on them anymore, right? So that doesn't really make any sense. This is actually wrong. And if you look at it, again, if you ever want to see any kind of stuff that's online, if I want to say W3 schools, again, go back to that because it's a good resource, right? And if I look at jQuery, because a lot of times we want jQuery, right? There's a whole jQuery tutorial on W3 schools on how to do stuff, and it kind of details all this stuff, right? This is definitely a good resource, but the best resource for jQuery is the jQuery website itself. jQuery website. And let's take a look at that one. So if I go back to jQuery, this one, here's jQuery. And I want to look at my docs, my documentation for jQuery. So I've got plugins, contribute, support. Here's my learning center. Here's my events for jQuery. They used to have them. And it tells you how to do stuff with traversal and event handling, a really simple way of looking at things right away. They also refer to a few books that exist, right? But down here, there's an API documentation. So here's my jQuery API, right? And I can search for anything I want. For example, toggle, right? And I search for toggle, right? I'm going to go down to it. There it is. It says bind 2 or more handlers to the matched elements. Now look what it says. It says deprecated. Deprecated as of 1.8. And now it does this, toggle. It says display or hide the matched elements. So this was taken over. So toggle used to do what I said in my documentation, but now it does this. Sometimes this happens. And this is called a breaking change. So if you had an earlier version of jQuery that toggle worked on, but now you downloaded and installed the new version, suddenly your code wouldn't work anymore. Because someone's changed the same function. They made 2 functions with the same name. And what they're doing is instead of toggling, right, it's something different now. And there's another thing for this. There's another one of these things, right? Notice it says removed, right? Events, mouse events. These are all the different kinds of events you can do with mouse. So if I click on events, mouse events, these are the different things you can do now with your mouse events. These are all the ones. Mouse down, mouse enter, mouse leave, mouse out. And then these are equivalent to whatever the element is, dot add event listener, click, on click, do something, right? Whatever the get element by ID, whatever the thing is, dot add event listener, dot context menu, bind an event handler to the context menu for JavaScript, right? These are all the mouse events now. And here's toggle. Oh, wait. Bind 2 or more handles. And this is, look what it says, deprecated. We don't use that anymore. Okay, this is really important to look at, guys. Because if you don't see this stuff, if it says one thing in your documentation, it doesn't work like that, it's usually because it's been deprecated. All right. So that's incorrect. But double click, mouse enter, mouse over, mouse out, and hover all work. To give you an idea of how this works, let's do a hover. Right? So whenever I hover, let's take a look at that. It says bind 1 or 2 handlers to the matched elements to be executed when the mouse pointer enters and leaves the elements, so both. And it gives me an example of how this works. Here's hover, and it should give me a little bit of an example. My selector, mouse enter, and mouse leave, that's equivalent to what hover does for us, right? A long example of how this works. So here's a good example of hover. When I'm hovering over this all list items, I want you to add in this span of star dot star star star, append star to the end of it. But when I'm out, right, remove the last element. That's what it does. So remove this span that I'm adding. I'm not adding this element. Notice I'm also using the keyword this, right? And what does the keyword this mean? It means this inside this context. Where whatever element that I'm pointing to, the this keyword says, hey, whatever element you get, do something to it. right? That's another thing that can be done, right? So I don't have to put in the list item again. I don't have to do this twice. I just have to say, hey, whatever you returned, point to that again and do something else. Here's another example. I'm hovering over a list item with a class of fade, right? For all list items with a class of fade, hover, right? Then the first function, do this part, right? So here's my first function, right? And then when I fade out and I fade back in. So when I hover, I fade out and fade in. It's interesting. I don't do the second part though. When I come out, it's not like I change what I'm doing. Okay, let's try this out for a second so you can see a more concrete example. So I've got my buttons on my projects page, right? And instead of doing toggle, I want to do hover, right? And notice I can have one or more event handlers. So here's the first one, right? And here's the second one. I'll write them together. So I'm going to put them on separate lines so you can see them easier. All right, here's the first one. And then I'll use a comma, and then here's the second one. Now they're empty right now, but we're going to make them so that they're full. Okay. Why is this a problem? Why is this giving me an error? I'm getting an error here for this thing. You have an idea? It says JavaScript expected. Right, here's my first function, and I spelled function wrong. How about that? Okay, there we go. First function, and here's my second function. Right, so both these anonymous functions. This one will trigger when I hover over, and this one is when I hover out. Right? Take a look. I append or I remove. So let's change this. So when I hover over my buttons, I want to change the element. Right, so I'm going to say, hey, well, I want to change the element of the button that I recover. Right, so this, remember I used this keyword. I want to change its attribute, its class. Right, I want to change this or its sorry, I want to change the attribute, the class attribute, right, to button success. Right, and I'll say button large again. I'll keep a large button. It's a new class. And then when I hover out, right, when I hover out, I want, if this works properly, I want to change the class to back to button danger. And so this is what it does. So this is the first function that triggers when I'm hovering over, and this is the other function that triggers when I'm hovering out, when I kind of leave the button. Enter, leave. Let's see how it goes. So I'm going to go back to my code, and I hover over, and I hover out. Hover over, and I hover out. So I get this really weird effect where I can get these buttons that show up a little differently now, right? So this is kind of a cool little effect. You can do the same thing with CSS, right? But the great thing about this is it compounds the stuff that I can do, right? Not only does it have functionality, but I can change the style on the fly as I hover, special effects, as I hover. Hover. All right. So that's these things. Hover, toggle, deprecated. Don't use that one. Okay. And here's some examples of the events. So for input elements with that are the type of text, when I double click on them, right, I want you to wipe out the value that was inside of them. So whatever the text element is in the form, when I double click onto it, I want you to reset it. That could be very good for us, right? I'm entering some information. If I double click it, it's gone. Right? How does that work? Well, remember that I have in my contact page. There's my contact page, right? I have a bunch of elements here: my contact number, my name, and so on, right? So I want to look for all elements, all input elements with a type of text, right? And every time I double click on them, I wipe them out. Okay, my contact page. How do I do that? So going back to my app.js, and I can go into my contact page. Right, here's my contact page. And I want to use jQuery to do all this, right? So I want to do the following. I want to say before I get my send button event, I can say, well, hey, jQuery, I want you to get all elements, right? All input elements with a text, That's the type. Type is text. Right? All elements with the type of text. When I double click onto them, right, I want to do this callback function. What's the callback function going to look like? Like this. When I double click on all the input elements of my form, right, I want you to do $ again. Hey, jQuery, get the element that I'm returning, and then I want you to clear it, right? So the value is going to be equal to this. I'm going to clear the value of that element. So this clears the text box. I double click on it. Make sense? So here's my text. I'm searching for text boxes or input boxes with the type of text. When I double click, run this anonymous function, and then inside the function, the first operation I want to do is I want to clear the value of the text box. Okay, let's try this out. So I'm going to go back to here, and I'm going to go to my contact page, and I'm going to enter my stuff and say, hey, Tom, and my contact number, right, 416-555-5555, and my email address, tom@example.com. My message, this is my message. Now, if I double click on any one of these, right, like this one, right, my expectation is when I double click on it, it's going to wipe out. How come it's not working? Oh, it worked there, right? It's like I got to double click on this one, right? But it worked on this one, but not these ones. How come? This is my message. Oh, let me answer that in a second. This is my message. This is email. This is number, and this is text, right? So, right? Oops. If I double click here, it doesn't work here. But if I double click here, gone, wiped out. Right? Now I want to wipe them all out. I don't care what they are. How do I do that? I'm no longer searching for a type, right? This search for a type. That's the filter that I'm using, right? What I want to search for is for all of them, right? And they're all input, right? All inputs. So instead of searching for text elements or that type of text, I just search for input elements, all input elements, right? That's text boxes and all kinds of other boxes, right? Now if I go back and try it again, so I go, no, right? My contact number. Right, my address, my message, this is my message. And if I double click here, wipes it out. Here, wipes it out. Here, wipes it out. Here, no, not going to happen, right? Because it's a text area. So if I double click here, not going to happen. Right? So that's what this little thing does. And I can also replace it. I don't have to just add something. I can make it red. When I double click on it, I can make the background a different color. I can do text validation. jQuery is fantastic for validation, right? So I want to check a value. When someone enters something, when I enter it, I want to check a value. I can do that with jQuery very nicely, right? Okay. So that's what this is doing. Here's another one. I'm looking for all objects that have an idea of image list. I'm looking for the images of those objects that are contained in those objects, right? When I hover over that image, I want you to do the following. The mouse pointer has moved into an image element. When I move out, that mouse pointer has moved away or out of the image element, right? So I'm looking at the images whose parent have an ID of image list when I hover over them. Right? Make sense? Okay. Other events we should be aware of. Bind, unbind, one, and trigger. Okay. These are interesting. Bind basically attaches an event handler to an event. Unbind removes the event handler from an event. It's like doing add event listener and remove event listener. That's what it's like, okay? So when I bind, I add an event listener of type whatever I want, okay? Again, referring back to our API documentation, right, online, here it is. And if I go to my API documentation and I look at bind, just to show you this, right? Here's bind. It says attach a handler to an event for the elements. Okay, cool. Now, this is why I'm showing you this. So I know this is set. Deprecated as of version 3. Just got deprecated just now. It was alive forever, right? And if you look, it says event handler attachment. Okay, cool. These are the things that I can do now, right? So I can do jQuery proxy. This was deprecated. Now, here's some nice ones, eh? And these are the new way of doing things with jQuery. You can go on and off, right? Attach an event handler, and on, off removes an event handler. These are sexy. I have to tell you, these are the best ways of doing it. I'm sorry to say it this way, but we use this all over the place, on and off. Why? It makes more sense. Turn it on, turn it off, right? As opposed to bind and unbind. Bind and unbind is not intuitive for everybody, right? Let's take a look at on. Here's an example, right? By the way, it gives you the syntax, right? On, the event selector, and the data that I want to have some kind of handler, right? These are the things that you have. And in square brackets, it means that those things are optional. That's what it means. Let's get a code example going, all right? So, hey, I'm looking for a data table that's with a table body, and inside that a table row. So a table row that's inside of a table body, that's inside of an element that has the ID of table data. On click, when you click on that table row, I want you to show the text of that table row on the console. That's what it does, right? That's how you do on. And you can also specify other kinds of things. On click, on mouse over, on mouse leave, on things. So this is a very quick way of doing add event listener. And when you do off, you specify the event you want to remove from an element. So you don't want that element to work anymore that way. Much nicer way of doing things and more control than the click method. So I much prefer this way over the click method. So an example of that, really quickly, would be, here's double click, right? I want to write it the other way with the on method. I want to say the following. I want to rewrite this thing. So let's try this out. I'm going to write it below. I'm going to say, well, find all input elements, right? And then on, and then brackets the event type. And can I write double click? Is that possible? And for a list of events, so JavaScript events, you can kind of search for them. JavaScript events list. These are all the event types, right? There's W3 schools. And it should give you a list of events here that you can try out, right? On click, on change, on mouse over, on load. Okay, how about double click? How do I do double click, right? On double click. I want to double click on the thing. Is there such a thing? JavaScript, right? JavaScript, double click. Is that possible even? On double click, the jQuery double click event method. So there must be a way of doing double clicks. Remember, whenever we have on, we also have this part, and this part references the actual event, the name of the event. Double click, right? Let's see if it actually shows you here. It doesn't show you. Let's try it out. So on double click, do something, right? I want to do this anonymous function like we did before, right? I'm going to show you the exact same thing we did, right? But instead of, whoa, that was weird. I don't know how I got that. How did I? Whatever. Okay, so on double click. I don't know, but here's an event. Here's an event. I'm going to do. And what I want to do is definitely come back. Give me that back. So instead of I'm going to change my attribute of my input. No, I want to change my CSS. I want to change the back color, right? Which would be, right? Background. I think background color, if I'm not wrong. Sorry? Background by itself, right? Yeah, I think it's background. I think background color is the CSS, and I changed the background color to red. whenever I click onto it. Right? So whenever I double click, I'm going to leave both of these things. The one clears and the other one changes it to red. Let's try this out. Go back here, and if I did everything properly, double click. Oh man, what happens? Well, let's check and see what I get from an inspection perspective. Do I see any kind of errors? Well, the answer is no, sadly. So here, at Tom, right? If I double click, it erases it, but it doesn't do the second part because double click doesn't register. How about click by itself? On click, that registers, right? Save on click, red, right? That totally registers. But double click doesn't register, my friends. Double click doesn't mean anything in the JavaScript world. Yes? Double click, that'll be okay. Let's see if that works now. Yes, yay. That works. Thank you. I was like, that's really weird. I thought double click was working fine before, but no. All right, does that make sense? So this same event here is exactly, these two are the same way of doing things with double click. The other one is with the on method. This is specific to the double click. Here I can put whatever event I want. And somehow I really find this method preferable to me, right? Because I have more control. I don't want to just do this. I want to do whatever I want. As a programmer, I always want options, right? I don't want to be limited, okay? I mean, you should be getting the hand of it by now, a hold of it, how we're doing it. I'm showing it to you. You should be able to understand what's happening, how jQuery works. So what's the first thing you do with jQuery? Hey, jQuery, put that $sign in. That's what jQuery is. You're calling up jQuery. You're summoning the beast, right? Saying, jQuery, okay, I want to use your magic powers. Cool. What am I going to do now? In round brackets, I'm going to look for something on the page. What am I looking for? I'm looking for this element, whatever this element is. Okay, now do something to the element. That's what we use jQuery for more often. All right, let's keep going. How to store an event handler in a variable. Oh yeah, we can do this. My clear click event. Again, they're using bind and unbind. Bind and unbind is old syntax. We don't use that. We use on and off. Right? One is something interesting. One only does it one time. And if you look at the API documentation, right, for events, here's on, but where's one? Right? Well, one is still there, and one does something totally different. Attach a handler to an event for the elements. The handler is executed at most once per element per event type. Okay? Give me that example. So on, and here's one. This does it one time. This does it every time. That's the difference between on and one. So this is like once. Do this once. When I click on it, do it once. After that, it's done. Right? On and one. Okay. And I think this is a great place to stop today, actually. So I think I've given you enough to kill you, right? I've got 31 pages done out of 74, right? Yeah, man. Like jQuery is a huge library. And the next part of jQuery that I really want to handle with you is this stuff for methods. And what it does, some of the most important parts of this one is if you look through this, right? It has special effects, but there's also a part down in the bottom, which is validation, right? Here's validation, which we can talk about, as well as Ajax. And this is the meat and bones of what I really want to work with you on. Ajax. Because Ajax, when you look at jQuery, I'm going to show you a little preview of it. It looks much nicer. It looks like this, which is way nicer. I don't have to do an XHR object. I just have to do a get or get JSON, and we're done. Right now, you're going to need, you can use this again for your assignment. If you actually haven't finished assignment number 3, I don't know, you guys should probably finish assignment 3 by now, right? But let's say you didn't want to finish assignment 3 and you wanted to use this syntax, it totally works. Okay, talking about assignment 3, you guys asked me to show you how this works online, right? Because we have to try and figure that out. So let's save this document. Let's close off my PowerPoint. We'll get back to that next week, the second part of jQuery, right? But what you've asked me to do is a couple things. First of all, I want to connect my app to Azure. And for the next half an hour, we'll do that. All right? So my app is less than 10, right? And I got to update it because I made some changes. So I got these little inputs, little special effects. I'll leave them there. And I'll go in here, and in my app, you can see that I've removed and modified stuff. I've taken the TS and I've modified my app.js. Okay, so I'm going to say updated app.js with jQuery functionality. That's what I've just done. I don't know why. I don't want to spell the word function today. Okay, that's my update. And then I'm going to go to GitHub and push. Great, push. You know, now that I've pushed, GitHub has the latest version of my files. Fantastic. And you need to do this in order for you to check this out on Azure. Now, Microsoft Azure has a problem with any kind of JSON, right? So let's try this out first. I'm going to go up on Azure, so portal.azure.com, and I'm going to set up a new website, right? I'm going to go new. I'm going to go to web and mobile. I'm going to click web app. And under web app, when I go in here, I'm going to change where it says azurewebsites.net. I'm going to say my new web app, which is going to be called COMP1073-Winter 2017-Lesson 10, right? And then I'm using DreamSpark. I'm using an existing resource group, which is Canada East, with an existing SAP service plan. I'm going to connect it up to my dashboard and click create. All right, so I'm creating a new app on Azure. This is stuff you've already seen. Deployment started, and when it's done, after it's done its deployment dance, it'll take me back, right? And to see it in progress, oh, it's already done. It's too late. It's taking me back already. All right, so here he is. I've got my app, and what I want to do is I want to connect it to my code, right? And the way to do that is on the left, under deployment options, right? Here's my deployment options. I want to choose GitHub. So I'm going to configure GitHub. All regular stuff, right? I'm going to choose my project and my organization. In this case, it's Georgian, right? And my project that I last worked on, which is this one, COMP1073, W2017, lesson 10. And then I'm not going to configure a performance test. I'm just going to click OK. Now it's going to go out, grab the latest version of my code from GitHub, and install it locally. Now, it's not showing anything here, and that's what one problem Azure has. It doesn't update unless you click on deployment options again. And now you can watch to see that it's fetching from GitHub. Okay? It's not really changing anything. I'm just watching the fetch operation. Okay? So fetching, I'm waiting. And the only time you know it's for sure it's good is when you get a check mark. You know that it's fetched everything. Now, does the check mark mean that everything is working? No, it just means that you got everything from GitHub and you've installed it into your web application. That's all it means, okay? The only way you know that it's working is if you test it. Now, see, it says check mark. Hey, Tom, you did everything correctly, right? Well, wrong, and we'll show you this now. If I go back up, and if I click on overview, and if I click on this little link here, and if I take myself out here, I'm going to be missing some information, yeah? Some key information, like the game list. Well, how come I'm not getting it? You just said that I can get my game list, yeah? There's a problem with jQuery and JavaScript in general, getting data from the server. It's something called cross-site scripting errors, and they prevent it. What Azure does is it prevents that any kind of security hole like that by disabling JSON to work locally. All right, let's take a look at that. So if I inspect, right, you can see that I'm getting a bunch of errors now. It says failed to load resource, server responded with a status of 404, my favicon is not there, and also this one, failed to load resource, the server responded with a status of 404 for this one, games.json. I know it's there, I put it up there. And it says uncaught type error, cannot read property for each of undefined. Of course you can't, because games doesn't exist. So I want to load JSON file in JavaScript with Azure, right? Serve static JSON files with the Windows Azure website. Yay! Let's see what it says. Okay, it says, if you upload a JSON file to your Windows Azure website and try to access it, we'll give you a 404 because the MIME type of JSON is not set by default. Okay, cool. So it says, configuration, system web server, static content, MIME map, file extension, JSON is this. Now, I'm not sure this is the answer nowadays. I think they've changed this around. And it also says, hey, watch this web config file. Well, first of all, let's take a look at what we've got, right? Remember I told you, just be careful with a web config file because it also does other things for us. So here's our web.config file. And you can see what I'm looking for. Configuration, system web server. Okay, here it is. Static content. Cool. And now in there, I want to add a MIME map file extension, right? This part, I want to add that in here somewhere, right? Which is right here. Now, this is only one part. Notice that this other one has another one, right? WAF2, it adds in, it removes it and adds it, removes it and adds it. Oh man, we're just adding it. Is this enough? Let's check this out. So I'll say I modified, updated web.config for JSON. Pushed it. Going back to Azure, right? I'm going to go to my deployment options, and I'm going to see that it deployed. It deployed, right? Going out to the home page, refresh, and now I see everything. Done. That's it. Right? So that'll give you everything you need for your assignment 3. So if you couldn't do assignment 3, if it didn't work, and you're having trouble retrieving data from a file, a JSON file, serving static files, you just have to add in that one line in your web config. And if you look at my web config, all I did was on line number 13, I added in a file extension of type JSON so that it understands what I'm doing. Otherwise, it doesn't know what type it is, and so from a security standpoint, it'll block it. It won't find it at all. Right? Does that answer your question? People who, I don't know, anybody else? Are you sure? You guys okay with this one? Alex, you good?
I guess.
Did it fix it for you? Okay. A lot of times it's that. And sometimes Microsoft has these finicky things in Azure. Don't worry about them too much. All right? There's always a fix online somewhere, right? When you put in the right search. Guys, that's all I have for today. I don't want to overload you with more jQuery. I think this is good. Let's come back next week, and when we come back next week, we'll talk more, right, about jQuery and Ajax and everything else. Okay, guys? Thank you so much, and see you next week.